Now that you know a little bit about HTML, let's talk about CSS. Before we get into talking about CSS, let's just quickly talk about the elements that make up any web page. Basic web pages are made up of HTML, CSS, and possibly JavaScript. The HTML creates the content layer. This is the actual information that you see on the page. Then we have the presentation layer. This is made by CSS. It controls how the information looks on the page. And finally, pages may have a behavioral layer. This is going to control how users can interact with the various page elements. So HTML provides the content layer, it forms the structural foundation, and it instructs browsers on how to render the basic content. The CSS provides the presentation layer. It creates the visual style. And the JavaScript provides the behavior layer. It adds interactivity to the page and allows you to build out more dynamic web pages. You can think of HTML as the bones or the structure of the page. The CSS is the presentation or the clothing of the page. And the JavaScript is the behavior of the page. So what exactly is CSS? Imagine if you're building a house. You start off by building the frame. So you'll start off with plain wooden beams in the shape of a house, but it doesn't really look like a home yet. In order to make it look livable, you need to fill out the rest. You need to use drywall and shingles. You need to paint the walls, install the windows, and so on. The wooden frame may make up the skeleton of the house, but it needs the pieces that you add around the frame to appear complete. You can think of CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, as the pieces for a web page. CSS is a computer language known as a style sheet language, and pretty much every web page that you see on the internet uses CSS to make their HTML look stylish and pleasing to the eye. Here's an example of a web page that is just displaying with HTML. This is the exact same page, but now it's displaying with CSS. In terms of HTML, the HTML pieces are identical. Both versions contain the exact same content. As you can see though, CSS is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this web page. Without CSS, the page is like a frame of an unfinished house. You might recognize the rough shape of what the finished thing will be, but it definitely isn't enough on its own. So what exactly does CSS look like? Well, CSS is written in rule sets, each of which selects or targets some part of your HTML in order to change its look. For instance, if you want every paragraph element on your web page to have teal text, you can use a simple CSS rule set to accomplish this. Here is another CSS rule, but this one is slightly more complex. Let's go ahead and talk about the parts of a CSS rule so that you understand the terminology. In this example, the selector is H1. What we're doing is we're targeting all of the heading 1 elements on a page. Every rule set includes a pair of curly brackets. These wrap around at least one declaration, if not more. Inside of the curly braces, we have declarations. A declaration is made up of a property followed by a colon, and then we put the value followed by a semicolon. The property is the type of CSS declaration that you are making. There are many to choose from, and they accept different values to do different things. In this case, I'm using color, which is going to change the text color of all H1s to teal. In addition, I have another property of font size, and this is changing the font size of all of the H1s to 36 pixels. Every property value pair always needs to be divided by a colon, and then we terminate each declaration statement with a semicolon. There are a lot of CSS properties and associated values that allow you to control all aspects of your web page. For right now, we're just going to start off with the basics. We're going to be using element selectors. That means we'll be selecting various elements on the page, and we're just going to use some of the most commonly used properties so that we can make modifications to the page. We'll go ahead and we'll look at that next.